Tracy lighted another cigarette. Funny thing about thinking. In the Army, there were times when he had found it easy to think. Things he'd never thought before. Cut off from everything, somehow it was easier. At home, well, always there's a place where you quit thinking. You quit or you get out. You go so far, run into a sign, road closed. After that, you detour. But in the Army, somehow, it was different, at least for him. People thought about different things. But when he and his unit were sent to Marseille, he began a thinking that was new for him, strange. He had begun this way. He liked the place and used to walk for hours at night on the streets, feeling something about it not easy to get at. It was as different from Maxwell as two places can be different, and yet it seemed familiar to him, as if a part of him that had never lived in Maxwell had found a home here. One night, it's hard to know how a thing gets going in your mind, he began to remember Nani. He was walking along a street whose name he never knew. There was music somewhere and voices somewhere, and in the shadows a girl softly accosted him. He didn't answer her, but a tone in her voice sounded in his mind after he passed her. There was a feeling in his mind, too, that he'd been here before. The music, the easy, soft laughter, and he felt relaxed, relieved, as if a tight band was slowly loosening. He thought, I'd like to dance with Nani. He'd never thought in his life of dancing with Nani. Never had wanted to dance with her, but now he thought, we could dance here. That was all. But the words turned a key, suddenly opening his memories. She had never been something to think about until then. She had been something you tried not to think about, something you needed, you took when you needed, hushed your mind from remembering. Now, in Marseille, she was here. All the little things filling his mind, voice inflections, odd way she said the word down, brushed up hair above her temple, vein that throbbed when she was tired, sudden quick way she would lean forward when excited, though her voice would stay low. She wasn't a Negro girl whom he had in a strange, crazy way mixed his whole life up with. She was the woman he loved, and he saw her tender and beautiful, holding in her eyes her pliant spirit, in the movement of her body, her easy, right words, low, deep voice, all that gave his life its meaning. She was that, and he suddenly knew it. It was as if walking along a road cluttered with people and things, where all is confusion, made more confused by the rules that people move by. You almost step on something. You pick it up, knowing you found the thing you've been looking for. Covered with dirt, caked with it, yes, but you take it along, as you take a little image, knowing it has meaning for you. You take it along everywhere you go, but you never seem able to get by yourself long enough to brush the dirt off. He brushed the dirt off those nights walking up and down the streets of Marseille, and saw for the first time what it was he had taken with him all his life nearly, but never had looked at. He knew this was Nani, and he had to see her in Maxwell like this, before the dirt and dust settled back on the image. Once entering his mind, the idea never left him. He became absorbed in his memories, discovering countless little things about her. The way her eyes would shine sometimes in the twilight, the tremble of her lips when she talked of things that had meaning for her, her smile, always on the edge of laughter, though rarely breaking into sound, the quick, easy way she stooped to speak to a child, the bend of her body to his, the simple, deep, profound giving of herself to him. He knew this now, and his mind ached for the completion of a reality that until now only his body had accepted. When his boat docked in New York, he saw Laura on the pier, and he was sorry. It was natural for a sister to meet a brother who's been overseas for 2 years, but he was sorry, for he wanted to meet no one, see no one, hear no voice he'd ever heard before, until he saw Nani. And she went with him to Pennsylvania Station. She stood there waving as he went down the steps to the tracks, peering at him through her bifocal glasses, smiling vaguely. He pushed the South from him as he went through it, pushed everything he had ever known or feared or hated or believed in away from him on that trip down. The South was a picture full of things, people, smells, deeds, sounds, but no feeling. No feeling. His mother and father met him at the depot. Mother in a new fall suit, tailored and smooth, driving her new Buick, and Dad, sloppy and rumpled as ever, and a little tired looking. There was a moment when Tracy looked at Alma and Tut and knew he was their son. One moment, and then he was again the only real thing. All the rest was shut away from him. All day he did the expected. He was a hometown boy come back from the wars, and people were glad to see him. When evening came, he borrowed his mother's car. Even as her face glazed, even as her eyes sharpened, with the old question, he did not let it reach him. The old 2-story ramshackle house in which the Andersons lived was just as it had been 2 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe 20. Paint peeling, roof needing repairs, but he did not look at it. Nani opened the gate. He saw her cool and slim, dark hair brushed back from her temples exactly as he had dreamed her, waiting. She was laughing softly to keep the tears back as he kissed her. Then he held her for a moment, and she looked at him. His eyes, his face, hair, his eyes looked so long, so steadily, that he smiled and said, "Well, maybe you don't know me." He began to guess something of the emptiness his coming back had filled, and it surprised him, for never in all his thinking had he remembered that his coming back might mean something to her also. In the car he had put his old phonograph and a record. Everything he did now was as predetermined as the events of a dream. He took it out of the car, and they went down the old path through the field to Aunt Tice's deserted cabin. He put the phonograph down, turned to her as she stood in the doorway. There was a shining in her eyes. He'd never forget it. "I've dreamed," he said, and felt shy, "of dancing with you. Seems a little crazy, doesn't it?" He laughed to make the words easy, for they seemed important and too heavy, and he didn't want them to seem so. He put on a record, came to her. The room was dim, only a little light sifting through the broken roof. He touched her, she was in his arms, and they danced together. In that funny old cabin, with a floor that sagged at the left end and walls covered with cobwebs, they danced, Tracy and his image, and there was no dust, no dirt anywhere. It was easy to stop, though the record played on until there was nothing but a scratching noise left, and finally she looked at the machine, half smiling, and he leaned across her and clicked it off. Afterward they talked. He talked. They went out, sat on the steps of the cabin, and he talked more than he had ever talked in his life to anyone. Not of important things, but of the little things, of the men in his company, the way he'd think of sulphur springs when he was thirsty, though he'd never liked sulphur water, just little things. And then he began to talk about his future, things he wanted to do. He talked of going into business, a chain of filling stations, might make money at that. He laughed. "Or," he said suddenly, "you know, we might go back to France. I've made friends. I could work in a bank there. When he said the word, something happened to Nani's face, and he was startled. It was as if he had lighted 10,000 candles with one small, half-thought-out word. Then they stood to go, for it was late, and he kissed her. And there was between them that moment caught and forever stamped on a memory, when every desire, every fantasy of one person meets and blends with those of another. He left her at the gate, drove home, put up the car, started upstairs. He wanted a smoke, had no cigarettes, decided to walk down to the drugstore for them. He wanted to walk, for some reason. College Street was dark. The homes where his neighbors lived were silent. Suddenly he heard voices. After the stillness, they seemed loud, noisy, although hardly above the usual conversational level. Under the street lamp near the drugstore, he met the Reverend Livingston and Rosanna. The Reverend had on his preacher coat, and Rosanna, his wife, was dressed in some kind of blue finery and a hat. Apparently they were coming from lodge meeting. They were laughing heartily, having the street to themselves at this late hour, and the Reverend's black face was crinkled with laughter as he walked along, spryly whirling the cane that usually he leaned on before white people. Rosanna was floating beside him, being one of those fat women so light on their feet that their weight seems to act as a sail filled with the stiff breeze. Her light yellow face was merry now with her joking. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Tracy!" Rosanna's voice curved to the ground as she spoke his name, though he heard, too, the razor edge of mockery that cut a swathe through her humility. He had caught Rosanna without her white folks' manner, and it was as if she were hastily buttoning it on as she spoke to him. "Well, well, howdy, Mr. Tracy," said the Reverend in the voice he reserved for pulpit and white folks. "Welcome home." Although he had never liked him, Tracy decided he should shake hands with the Reverend. It was his family's custom to shake hands with a few of the colored folks on special occasions. So he shook hands with the Reverend, said, "Howdy, Rosanna, how are you?" "Very well, Mr. Tracy, except for my blood pressure. Very well indeed," sighed Rosanna. She knew her place, and hushed after that, and let the men do the talking. "When you get in, Mr. Tracy?" "This morning." "Just fresh home, then?" "That's right." "Mighty glad you're home. Mighty glad to have you back in Maxwell." And that should have ended matters. In the old world, that would have been all. They would have gone on to Negro quarters to be forgotten, and he would have stayed in Whitetown, forgetting. But that was not all. As they stood there between the speaking and the turning away, Tracy felt as if the blood were draining from his veins. All the feeling he had was a physical sensation. He was tired as hell, that was all, and nothing was worth doing. There was not a word in his mind that explained his feeling. All he knew was that 30 minutes ago he had been with the woman he loved. Now there was a colored girl named Nani. That was all there was to it. A colored girl named Nani. Why it was so, why the accidental meeting with the Reverend and Rosanna could have done this, he did not know. All he knew was, as he stood there looking at them, a door slammed in his mind, shutting out the new world, shutting out Nani with it. He was just there on the sidewalk, where he had always been, feeling the feelings he'd always felt. He had been somewhere, in a dream maybe crazy. Maybe it had been shell-shock. He laughed. A plain amnesia. That's better. Maybe he'd lost not his memory, but his white feelings. Ought to be thankful he hadn't lost his memory, too. Well, he was sane now. The dream was over. Whatever he had forgot how to feel, Rosanna had made him remember. He had come back to Maxwell. Yes. The Reverend had said it. He had come back home.